Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Heidi van Rooyen from the Human Sciences Research Council. A very warm welcome to all of you in the room with us here at the CSIR in Pretoria. A warm welcome to our panel, who I'll introduce in a minute. But very warm welcome and thank you for joining us for the session, which is about exploring the viability of political party coalitions in South Africa. I'm sure you'll agree a very, very important and a very timely topic. Just a few words by way of introduction to help us get into the room together for this conversation. Coalitions, I'm sure you're all aware, have become increasingly prevalent in South African politics. They shape both the dynamics of governance and representation structures. They do a couple of things, these coalition governments. They offer a platform for multiple parties to collaborate and operate together. But recent experiences at local government level have spotlighted, alongside some of the opportunities, some of the challenges. And I think coalition governments raise critical questions about the efficacy of such coalitions over the long term. Particularly relevant and timely is that we are gearing up for the 2024 general elections, where the prospect of coalition governments at provincial and certainly at national levels looks quite likely. And so I'm really excited to be here, to be moderating this conversation and this discussion with our guests and our panelists. So online, who you may have seen already, is Melanie Verwoerd. She's a former Member of Parliament for the ANC, a former ambassador to Ireland, and the former director of UNICEF Ireland. Her third and most recent book on the ANC is Precarious Power, Compliance and Discontent under Ramaphosa's ANC, and that was published in 2021. Also in that same year, she edited a Mistra publication, Marriages of Inconvenience, The Politics of Coalitions in South Africa. And she's also the editor of a soon-to-be-released Mistra Coalition Barometer from 2021 to 2023. So very warm welcome to you, Melanie. And then with me on my immediate left is my dear friend and colleague, Professor Nanya Bolamula, a distinguished legal scholar who leads one of the programs in the divisions in the HSRC, the Developmental, Capable and Ethical State Research Division. She holds a Doctor of Law degree from the University of Pretoria, specializing in participatory democracy, social justice, gender equality, and socioeconomic rights. It's always lovely to be with you, Nanya, in whatever capacity that is. In the middle, our gentleman kind of rounding up our gender quota for the day, because if we didn't have you, Malusi, we would be really in serious trouble. So we're very, very delighted to have you, not only for who you represent gender-wise, but I think also for your wisdom and your perspective on the issues that we're going to be talking about today. Malusi Nkala is a senior researcher at Corruption Watch with expertise honed for human rights-related activities and anti-corruption work. His skills include conducting research, storytelling, written or spoken. We should definitely talk in the break, Malusi. Public speaking and facilitating workshops. So very warm welcome to you. And on the far end, but certainly not furthest from us in this topic, is Professor Susan Boyson. She's an analyst and media commentator. She's research director of the Mapungubwe Institute of Strategic Reflection, Mistra, which I was rolling off my tongue earlier on but hadn't practiced, and a visiting professor at the Wits School of Governance. As you can see from the panelists, both Melanie online and the three were with us in the room today. We really are very, very lucky to be in the company of all of you. We will learn from you and your wisdom on this really important topic of exploring and looking at coalition governments in our context. So the conversation will happen in two parts, about a 40-minute conversation around some questions now. We will have a little video break in the middle of that, where Nanya will be sharing some of our latest results from our social attitude surveys looking at coalition government. And so that's a nice kind of midway point in our conversation. The 40 minutes after that, we'll come back and have another 3 or 4 questions to round up the conversation. But I thought maybe just to get us started off and to get all of your voices in the room, as the panelists, if I could ask you, if you think about coalition politics, coalition government in South Africa, what 3 or 4 words come to mind? So 3 or 4 words, quickly. Don't overanalyze, we're going to analyze later. 3 or 4 words, quickly. Malusi looks like he's ready.
Wow, thanks. Exciting, stagnation, and new.
Great, thank you. Susan?
The times are changing away from one-party dominance, and political parties are not quite ready for this change. They're into mischief and party political tricks and see coalitions as an extension of of elections, hoping to achieve what they had not achieved in elections and in a largely unregulated environment.
Okay, thank you. We will unpack some of those really interesting comments there, Susan. Nanya, to you.
I think fresh, little bit frightening, and lots of potential.
Okay, fresh, frightening potential. Melanie, what are your 3 words?
Possibilities. But then also, if you ask me, my other 2 words would be chaos and instability. That's what I think.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. So we're going to kick off then with our first question for the panel. And this is our first question. We've had coalition governments at the local and provincial level. What do you think they have taught us? About our maturity as a democracy. What have we learned from them? And I'm going to start with you, Susan, because I think part of your opening comments were kind of leading us into those responses. So
Sure. We have got some history of coalition governments in South Africa, national level, especially around 1994 for a few years, provincial here and there, local, yes, escalated incidents since 2016, 2021. But yes, the recent culture is much more pertinent, much more relevant. And in this new culture, there is much more of these adjectives and nouns that we have now introduced into the discussion, of the uncertainty where it's going to go to, of political parties not quite ready and would have to become very ready very rapidly following the elections in all likelihood to adopt this as a new form of government. Because the new form of government, it is going to be for the foreseeable, probably in all probability, I should say, for the foreseeable future through the next few elections. And so it is adopting, embracing a new culture that is going to be in pretty stark contrast to the election campaigns and what political parties individually proclaim to be running for in this election. So this election is signifying a transition, but the transition that will have to follow in the wake of this election is probably much more intense and very, very serious.
thank you. Who would like to go next? Melanie, let's pull you in so that we don't leave you out too much there. You're sitting on the top of our head, so it's a you've got a lovely position. Every time I look up, I see you and I'm reminded. So let's pull you in. Your responses to
Looking
that
down on you
question.
guys. I think one needs to distinguish a little bit between national and local government. I think, local government, well, first of all, one should say at local government level, the vast majority of coalition governments have actually worked. But the problem is the ones that didn't work were the spectacular failures, and that was mainly in the big metros. But what we have seen at local government level is the lack of maturity with local politicians in particular. Personalities come into play far more so than ideology. Personal grievances. I know of one council where the thing fell apart because it was a balance of power, and one councillor accused another councillor of sleeping with his sister 20 years ago, and that was that. The coalition fell. That's very much prevalent. That kind of personality, local issues, is very prevalent at local level. It will be, assuming that we will get some form of coalition at national level and provincial level, it will be slightly different there. Because first of all, I think it's going to be driven from national downwards, slightly different type of politicians and so on. Of course, the challenges are twofold. The one is to get the coalition. So you need the parties to buy in and get the coalition going. And then the thing that I think is going to be as challenging is to keep the coalitions together, because that's what we've learned at local government level. They get it, and then it falls apart. And that's the one thing as a country, as excited as people are about coalitions, I'm very worried about it. But is the fact that the one thing we know from international investors, from from the rating agencies and so on, what they need more than anything is stability. And that's going to be what we need to, whatever form we're going into, we need the stability to be there.
Thanks, Hedy. So I think, yes, maturity is needed here and also planning. So we can't wake up post 29 May, and realize we need to do something because we now have to form coalitions, if it happens. So there needs to be some form of planning or preparation for something like this. And I'm not sure if that is happening. In countries where coalitions work, mostly the cold countries in Europe, they actually have coalition statements that they release prior elections. So people can actually make a choice based on those particular statements or mandates. So I am worried about the level of preparedness if it happens again. In the World Cup 2010, there was an octopus called Paul who was able to predict the winners of the matches. But Paul unfortunately died, and so we don't know who the winners are going to be. I have a feeling that there's more likely to be coalition government at provincial level than at national level. That's just the feeling that I have. The provinces are an interesting hodgepodge of different ideas, different people that live in provinces, different cultures within provinces that may lead us to coalitions. National, I think that the ANC still has quite a strong base that's very loyal. And so I would be surprised, personally, if they don't get their 51.
Okay, good. We're going to go to that just now. But let's go to you, Malusi, first in terms of your response to that question about coalitions and what have we learned thus far.
Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting time because for at least for a large period in our democracy, 20 years plus, it was a foregone conclusion that one party takes all and pretty much directs the play. Now we're in a situation where our politics, or at least what coalition is telling us, is about how fragmented our political landscape is. And with that fragmentation comes a level of distrust by ordinary people in not only politicians, but sadly institutions and to an extent democracy as well. So it's what coalition is teaching us is that it's a matter of a new way of politicking. It may be a period of a renaissance of some sort or renewal for South Africa where now a new type of politician is going to emerge. I don't think we should underplay the importance of the Concord decision a few years ago where now independent candidates could enter the fray. I know that people don't think that the legislation is quite apt for that at this point in time, but as we work through those characters are also going to have an impact in how these new politics are being shaped. And so it's going to be about negotiation and about prioritizing. And what's going to matter is whether do we prioritize the needs of the people in terms of service delivery, or do we prioritize ideologies, and in between that, what are the values that actually matter most for South Africa 30 years on?
So thanks very much for those responses to that first question. And I think already in your responses we can hear reflected a bit more deeply some of your opening words. So a sense from you, Malusi, a moment of renaissance, perhaps a moment for something new to emerge, touching on those deeper messages that kind of lie under talk about coalition and issues around trust or mistrust in government. But I think also pointing to you some of the others, pointing to some of the challenges we've had. And what are some of those key requirements around stability, maturity, planning, which we'll come to in a little while. But if we can just stay with this view that's come up from your response in this first round, which is What is your sense, or what are your predictions in terms of what is going to happen at a national level? Are we likely to see a coalition at this national level? Nanya, your sense was more likely provincial than national, but are we likely to see a national level coalition? And are we going to be able to, in doing that, draw on, are there things we could be drawing on from our 1994, 1997 period where we had a government of national unity? So just some of your thoughts on, are we likely to see a national coalition now? And Malusi, I'm going to start with you and then work my way backwards.
I have to disagree with Prof. Nanya about the national aspect. I do think we are more likely to see a forced coalition at that level, whereas some of the provinces, perhaps your Limpopo, Eastern Cape, and maybe 2-3 others, will still perhaps see the dominance of the ruling party in those areas. But nationally, it becomes a question of how far below 50% the African National Congress goes. If it's a 47, 48, 49% percentage that they get, then they can easily just form a coalition with one of the smaller parties. Then they don't have to deal with the politics of a DA or an MK or an EFF. So it will be interesting then to see when it does form a partnership with the smaller parties, how does it navigate? Does it focus mainly on governance, or does it focus on the politics of surviving?
Yes, and next, thank you very much. Malusi and I certainly sing off the same hymn sheet here. I share that view that it's very unlikely that the ANC will be getting an outright 50% plus majority nationally in this election. The question is how much, and there is a factor of uncertainty. Yes, Nanya, I agree. There is still a possibility, although I think it's a small possibility, that the ANC can make that 50% level. Why? We have seen from public opinion polls, they're not everything, not all of them are good. We have seen very many, very odd little polls coming with pretending to have authentic results, and not all of them are good. But some of the opinion polls have been good, and they come out way below the 50%. Of course, the ANC is campaigning, and they're campaigning heavily and powerfully. There's a very powerful election campaign unfolding. That does mean, yes, there is a possibility that they can reach a 50%. It's very difficult for many voters to discard the serious contrast, a powerful contrast the ANC is drawing in its election campaign between post-apartheid and pre-apartheid. Post-apartheid and, yes, in the era of apartheid, and who is responsible for the what and how much their lives have changed, etc., and how much the ANC has to be credited for the 30 years of democracy. The ANC has benefited strongly, I believe, from the 30 years of democracy celebration, where every bit of celebration that we have justifiably of that milestone in South African history is also articulating beautifully with the ANC's election campaign. And they are really unfolding. We've seen that high forces on the ground, they control so much of the current media narratives. The point is whether it's enough for them to catch up. We cannot say authentically yes or no, but it is a huge amount of catching up that they actually have to do in a relatively small period. So there are big questions out there whether that is actually going to be possible. And yes, remember, they top up, and that is one of the models we've seen in local government coalitions emerging, especially in the last few years. Those small political parties can band together with the ANC. They often do not stand that strongly on ideology, much easier to be brought into, to be co-opted into power. But remember, for each percentage point that the ANC ends up below 50%, they will need 4 of those little parties' MPs. And not many political parties, small political parties in the past has been achieving that level of 4. So, and to hold together a coalition with several small political parties, I'm sure that is what the ANC is actually gunning for at this stage, to get that type of top-up. They don't want to fall into the space where they would rely, and here I agree with Melissa's type of analysis, for example, on the IFB, although they would, if it's 5 or 6 percentage points or so that they need. If they need around 10 percentage points, then we start looking at the EFF. They don't want to go that route. And beyond that, it's probably going, I know we're talking about that later, so I won't elaborate too much, about a government of national unity in which the DA could be included. And that is when they have a sense of national crisis. Around that, they would probably want to agree on a government of national unity.
Great, thank you. So we've had 2 so far, some 2 very good. We could have a national coalition. Nanya, you want to just say a bit more about your views about maybe not, and then we'll come to you, Melanie.
I think that it depends on voter turnout, who really cares about the elections. And we know who's registered, but who actually goes to the polls is a totally different thing. So who's loyal, who's passionate? And what I've been seeing is exactly that the ANC is leveraging the 30 years of democracy narrative very well. They have a lot of money behind them, including the state's money. And so they're able to come into the public space and to dominate the public space. And that's why I feel that it's been moving more in that direction than I thought it would. Because of this domination within the public space. And the lucky coincidence that we're celebrating 30 years of democracy this year. But of course, everybody's responsible for making democracy work in this country. Not one political party or one organization can take that credit. But things are also not good. And perhaps not enough is being said about what's not good and what hasn't worked. So I think, as I said, voter turnout is going to matter. Are the youth going to go to the polls is the question. Because if the youth go, we're going to see something different, I think. If they couldn't be bothered to go and vote, who knows? So there are a lot of dynamics, I think, that we're seeing at the moment. And a lot of it is noise. You know, the opinion polls that are popping up. And we do some work for the Independent Electoral Commission, a South African social attitude survey. Ben and Joré in the room. And, you know, we see things perhaps a little bit differently to the average pollster. Because we've been working on this for almost 20 years. We've been working on elections, but I'm not saying that we can predict what's going to happen, but perhaps have an idea of the nuances behind the scenes, so to speak.
Great, thank you, Melanie. To you.
What do we know for sure? What we know for sure is that KZN and Gauteng will go to coalition governments. There's nothing in the polls that suggests that the ANC can get over 50% there. I hope I'm still there. My screen is doing something funny.
Yeah, perfect. We see you.
It's still there? Okay, perfect. So there's nothing to suggest. And then there's the possibility that Mpumalanga can go as well to a coalition. And that's got to do with MK numbers, right? In KwaZulu-Natal, it's directly MK. That's just too high. So neither the IFP nor the ANC can get an outright majority there, from what we can see at the moment. Gauteng, same story. And then Mpumalanga is also the MK vote. And that depends how strong MK is going to keep on going. So at least 2 provinces for sure, 1 province possibly. On a national level, look, the ANC has always done this thing where in the last 8 to 6 weeks, or 6 to 8 weeks, they start rallying and their polls go up a little bit. And, you know, we can see that again. We can see it on the daily tracking polls. And I agree that polls have been, there's been some really dodgy polls coming out this time around. But I think, you know, one could look at the trends, and it does look like there's a very, very good chance for them at least to get above 45%. And then, of course, we're in an interesting playing ground, as everybody has said. Interestingly enough, it's well worth noticing that, of course, you don't need 50% plus one to form the government. You only need the president. So once the president is elected, you can form the government. That person forms the government. And you don't, I mean, there's a bit of a debate around this, I know, but I've double checked this with parliamentary legal people. The way the Constitution is written, you only need the most votes. So if there's a couple of candidates there, whoever gets the most votes, and one presumes it will be Cyril Ramaphosa, can go out and form the government. You also don't need 50% plus one to pass normal bills. You just need a majority of whoever is present in parliament, but it's of course risky if the opposition suddenly gets all their MPs there, then you won't pass it. But you do need 50% plus one to pass money bills in parliament. And if I'm incorrect, any of the lawyers there, please correct me. The point is that even if the ANC gets 50%, that is not, or 50 comma something, which they had in Gauteng the last time around, that's not safe enough for comfort. So they will have to get some agreement in that scenario as well with one or more of the smaller parties. Because you can never risk on the day with budget or money bills or something really important that you miss the vote with 2 or 3 people, because you never have everybody in parliament, people's cars break down, people are sick, people die, people get locked in the toilets, that kind of thing. It happens. Trust me, I've been an MP. And so they would need some form of agreement with somebody, at least with somebody small at that stage. Just one thing I feel very strongly about, and this has been said to me over and over and over again, I am absolutely convinced that the ANC would prefer to go with a DA coalition before they go with an EFF coalition. They are not keen on an EFF coalition. It is too dangerous, too unstable, etc., etc. One can go into the detail of that. So I think even if they need the bigger numbers, which it now doesn't look like they will get, this whole doomsday scenario that the DA is pushing is not really where the ANC wants to be either. So I think the likelihood that they'll need something at national level is there, but whether they will need one of the big parties, it doesn't look at the moment anymore, but definitely on provincial levels.
Susan was jumping up and down, not quite, but she was wagging her finger. Not quite, she was shaking her head. You were doing something, indicating some response to what you were saying.
Sometimes I'm quite in agreement.
Yes, okay. Do you want to maybe just comment on that, Susan?
Yes, if the president gets elected, yes, there is a majority vote that's needed there. It will already have to, imply a de facto alliance, a coalition with other parties. And yes, that it is an absolute majority vote. There's a detailed process of election by secret ballot there. And the vote can be, sorry about the microphones, the vote can really be split there. If there isn't an outright majority for a presidential candidate in any round, then there is a continuous system of elimination vote, round after round of voting. And that will imply a coalition. The ANC is really pushing for a strong role for the biggest party, even if it's not an outright majority party. We know a few of the most stable coalitions at local government level has been those that I call de facto coalitions, where the ANC or another big party hasn't got the outright majority, but the opposition party, biggest one, hasn't got any chance to get together a matching formation there to outvote. And then that becomes a type of de facto coalition. We can see that in a tentative legislation out for discussion now, coalitions at local government level by the COGTA. And in there, the ANC is really trying to push for the right of the biggest party, even if it isn't a party with an outright majority, to assume government. And they are trying to transfer much of that practice and proposed practice at local government level into the national. So watch that space.
ID, can I just say something?
Yeah, sure. I just want to say something, and then I'm going to just ask you all just to comment a little bit on this. And it is about what is clearly emerging is we don't know all the numbers as well as you do, but it certainly sounds from all your figures, 45, 47, 48, 49, 50, 50 plus 1, whatever those numbers are, that we are looking like we're in the space of a potential national coalition. And I just wanted to kind of link back a little bit to some of the things that you've already said. We've had a government of national unity from 1994 to 1997. Just say something to us about that very briefly. I'm going to ask Malusi, you to start. And to give us a sense of what that is, because I was too young. Well, not that young, but I certainly don't remember that we even had that thing. What was it? And what is the likelihood of us having that again now? It seems like we're saying it might be slightly different now, but so give us some sense of that. Start with Malusi, pop to you, Melanie, and then come back here to Nanya and Susan.
Yeah, I mean, it was such a different time, as young as all of us were. It's, I mean, on a global level, there was this, it was the period just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, so new relations were forming across the world, so there was this new excitement about this global community. And then in South Africa, this wonderful story to tell of, this man who was in prison for 27 years, and even though his party has received 60% plus, was willing to create this idea of a national government, a government of national unity. And it was more about transference of power and sharing those powers. But now, when you contrast that with what's happening now, corruption is one of those main things that we talk about mainly when it comes to politicians. There are a lot of squabbles and infighting amongst, and it's not only the ANC, it's all these parties, even the smaller parties. So it creates a whole new set of dynamics that not only the voter needs to consider, but these parties as well, if in the case that they should form a coalition.
Melanie?
So we don't need to debate this because the lawyers will have to sort this out, but just a quick one on the election of the president. Yes, Schedule 3 is very clear on what should happen, but it's all in the definition. And we've never had to test this because obviously every time that's happened up till now is the ANC president or candidate got the vast majority of votes. The question lies in the definition of majority. And usually the Constitution, and this is what I'm being told by people in Parliament who work with this, when the Constitution means 50% plus 1, it phrases it slightly differently. But like I said, it hasn't been tested. The run-off procedure that is there, these ones that I've spoken to have said that is in the case where the top two candidates get the same votes. So it doesn't actually say an outright majority, and this is going to be a very interesting thing if it has to be tested. But yes, I actually do agree that you cannot risk, even if that is the case, you cannot risk not having your coalition agreement signed before or agreed on before you go in for the presidential election. Because if by some miracle your opposition parties all agree on one candidate, of course, they will get that candidate. The GNU was a special time. I was lucky enough to be in Parliament. So it was an extraordinary time. And it worked because of, I think, the timing that was there. I love the idea of a GNU, but whether we are still in the right space for that, I'm not 100% sure, but I do think it can work. And I do think, of course, this is Cyril Ramaphosa's happy space. So if anybody can pull that off, it certainly can be him. And I mean, I think, but I also, just to come back about what is different, it was also a very different parliamentary environment at that stage. In that first parliament, almost every bill, I don't think we ever voted on things in committee. It was always through consensus, sufficient consensus. We were still very much in that post, we were still negotiating it in the beginning of the Constitution. So there was very much a thing about collaborating and so on. It's a very, very different space and very antagonistic and aggressive and much more antagonistic space now between political parties. So it would be much more challenging to keep that all together, I think, now.
Yeah, and where it feels like the meanings of those words that are at the heart of coalition, collaboration, consensus, we seem to have lost them somehow along the way. Nanya, did you want to comment on that? And we'll come to Susan.
Thank you. Yes, I wonder where they got lost and why they got lost. I mean, when you ask people about government of national unity, there is this sense of nostalgia for a time when it seems that politicians, leaders were working together for a better South Africa, and working in the interests of the people. What Nelson Mandela called stewardship. So you serve the people. And something happened along the way where that concept of working in the public interest, of caring about the needs of South Africans, has fallen off the table. And there's a lot of ego, there's a lot of narcissism, there's a lot of greed and desire for power. And it's a pity that we have, in just a matter of 30 years, seen the goodwill collapse. And I'm not really sure exactly when that happened, but our social contract is not as strong as it was then.
Susan?
Very briefly, yes, we are in a vastly different space this time around. 1994 was the big transition. It was reconciliation, big time. It was mapping this new future together. We have indeed lost a lot, sacrificed a lot in the period in between. Now I'm not sure that we are in the right space for another government of national unity. We are in a situation of severe crisis, where economic policies, socioeconomic policies, transformation processes are not working. There's always little snippets of evidence. Yes, it's worked, this has been delivered, etc. But the gaps are just too huge to call it a success overall. And there isn't sufficient crisis among political parties and in the ANC that there is a sense that there is this crisis, and that a new collaborative cross-political party effort is needed. I do not think we have crossed the bridge into recognition of that space, and even if objectively I think that space exists for a government of national unity, I do not see it politically.
Right. So we've come to the kind of end of this first half of the conversation, and as we've been talking, I've been thinking, and the piece that's missing is the publics, and the ways in which they know or don't even know about all of this and what it means, right? What does it mean, as you were saying, where it's worked in other contexts, there's been a sense of, there's a coalition statement, so you actually know when you vote, these are the things that I might be voting for, that I'm kind of signing up for, and I think we're not there. We don't even have that, certainly. So there's the piece of what does this mean for the public? What does it mean for South African society as a whole? This prospect of coalition, certainly repeated again at the provincial level, but also at a national level. So that's a good segue, I think, to take us into a little video clip of some of our results that we have surveyed in the HSRC through Nanya and her team. She's going to be speaking again, but from a different position, reclining on a couch, telling us about some of the highlights from that survey, and then we'll circle back and looking at, in that second half of our conversation, on how might we try and do this as we move forward.
Good afternoon and welcome to HSRC Connect. My name is Nanya Bolamula and I'm the Divisional Executive of a research program at the Human Sciences Research Council called the Developmental, Capable and Ethical State. We are here at this particular session of HSRC Connect to talk about something that everybody's talking about, and that is the elections, which will happen in South Africa on the 29th of May. So we're creeping closer every day. The hot topic this year in particular is coalition governments. And there have been a lot of predictions, there have been a lot of guesses as to what will happen after the 29th of May. But none of us are fortune tellers, so I'm going to share with you some research that we've done on coalition governments and give you an idea of how the public perceives this particular issue. The research has been done by the South African Social Attitudes Survey, which is housed in our division. And the South African Attitudes Survey is run annually. It's a representative survey of everyone in South Africa 16 years and older. We also do the voter participation survey for the Independent Electoral Commission, and we've been working for the IEC for more than 20 years. I'm going to be sharing with you some research as mentioned. A survey question that was asked in 2014 and then repeated in 2023. So it gives us a kind of an idea of how things have changed over that period of time. The question that was asked was whether people were more in favor or they thought that democracy would benefit more from multi-party government or single-party government. What is interesting is that in 2013, 39% of respondents said that they were in favor of coalition governments, or they think that they thought that the context would matter. This has dropped quite drastically from 39% in 2013 to 30% in 2023. So we have a situation where we've seen more coalition governments mushrooming in South Africa at the municipal level, but South Africans are not so much in favor of coalition governments. Probably because we have seen some problems at municipal level which have affected service delivery. So party political antics have affected some service delivery in some municipalities. There are, of course, municipalities where coalitions work, but mostly the media will focus on those that do not work. So is South Africa an exception to the rule? We're a country who feel that we are exceptional. So let's take a look at survey results from 2012-2013, the European Social Survey, and how South Africa sits in terms of its view on coalition government. Now there's a gradient where Switzerland and Finland really support coalition governments at more than 90% of the population. And on the other side, it's Britain who favor a single party government. And only 30% of their population would be happy with a coalition government. South Africa is much closer to Britain than it is to Switzerland and Finland. In actual fact, we are the country that's the fourth least supportive of coalition governments in that particular survey. So we rank along with Portugal, Belgium, and Britain when it comes to coalition governments and whether we support them or not. So that is the comparison from international perspective. Now, when we looked at the data that we have received from these surveys, one of the things that really jumped out was that once all the data crunching had been done, it was the provinces that came out as a determinant of whether people would be supportive of coalitions or not. Other factors, there was not much difference, but there was a marked difference in provinces. And this is very interesting because, of course, this is national and provincial government elections. The Western Cape and Limpopo favor single-party government at 50%. And then just under that is the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal at 48%. Then we have the other side where the Free State, and it's a bit of an outlier, 59% of people in the Free State support coalitions, which is a very high number. After that comes the Northern Cape and then Gauteng, but that's only in the mid-30s. So it would be interesting to know why the Free State is so much in favor of coalition government and what the circumstances are on the ground. So that is the provincial issue that came out. There was another issue that came out from the surveys, which is very interesting. And that is, when it comes to the crunch, the most important issue for people is service delivery. And this shouldn't come as much of a surprise, except that historically South Africans have been very party loyal. In other words, they will vote for their party and they will stick to their party. However, service delivery is becoming far more important to South Africans, and we understand why. We're still living in very bad conditions in this country. So people who believe that service delivery will improve with coalition government would of course support that idea. And actually 47% of the respondents in the survey, and this is then extrapolated to a representative sample, 47% say that they think that coalitions will improve service delivery. It would be interesting to know why, because the news generally is that coalition government is not working at municipal level. And the South African voter is not as immature as they are depicted by the media and in social media. South Africans seem to understand that coalitions may be necessary and would support a coalition if it was necessary at 56%. And of course, they would support coalitions if coalitions would improve service delivery. And the third thing is that about a third of South Africans say that they wouldn't feel betrayed if their party entered into a coalition after the elections. This is very important research. We see division and fragmentation in South Africa around these issues, but this looks like good news. It looks as if people are aware of what they're to expect after the elections, if necessary, coalitions. We don't know. And so it would be interesting to see how it works, and if service delivery doesn't pick up, how the public are going to react to that. This research is important for us as scholars, but it's also important for policymakers and NGOs to make decisions around how we approach these elections and how we make the public aware of the possibilities that would arise after the elections. But it will also then teach us something that we can apply in the elections that people say are even more important.
Great. So I'm going to allow the panelists, except Nanya, to maybe respond to some of those results. Just anything that kind of popped out at you, that kind of resonated with some of your thinking. We'll start with you, Susan.
Yes, indeed, and thank you for that research. It was quite very illuminating. And it also converges quite nicely with research that Mistra did with Ipsos just after the 2021 elections. We never published it, just kept it in our education. But it really showed, it may have changed a little bit now, granted, but really a nation divided. South Africans split pretty much down the middle when it comes on so many other aspects of coalition government, whether it's good, whether it's bad, whether it helps the service delivery, can help or not, etc. So I would say the verdict is really still to be formed. and that that voters are giving coalitions a chance. I found this particularly interesting, finding the question you had, whether they think their parties are betraying them, should they be forming coalitions or not. I think it's very significant that they do not feel their parties are betraying them. Because I think, interestingly, this election campaign, in many respects, is so dishonest that political parties say, well, we're running for an outright majority. X, Y, and Z parties are saying that, more than just the ANC. And we know that it is very unlikely that that will be the case. One respect in which I really think the multi-party charter has been doing something good, except that we know coalition agreements in South Africa do not mean much. They are not frequently not worth a piece of paper. They're written down on, or in whatever form they've been. But multi-party charter did something good in the sense that they said before election, these are the parties that we are likely to cooperate with. I would love to see all political parties to do that, because we know they're all likelihood, coalition government in waiting. And we actually want to know, because these coalitions come with policy compromises, negotiations, settlement on shared governance programs. Very likely, despite ideological differences, that political parties in a coalition will reach that kind of consensus. But which political parties that will be formed with, that can have a big impact on the power of the individual vote. Thank you.
Great. Melanie, will pop to you, and then we'll come back to Malusi in the room.
What I found interesting about the research, and again, as was said in the clip, it's not that surprising, but you can almost see where there is really bad service delivery. That's where people think, look, anything, just bring anybody else in. And where there's good, so Bloemfontein, if you've been to Bloemfontein, you would understand recently, you'd understand why people are saying, just bring us a coalition, whatever you do, just bring us a coalition. Because, you know, you can see whereas in the Western Cape, people are going, you know, especially those who live outside of the townships, DA is doing a good job. You know, we don't need a coalition here. Don't bring the other guys in. We're okay. So I found that, you know, I had to immediately, when the Free State thing came up, I sort of thought it was unsurprising. I also would love to hear from parties, because I also agree that the whole thing is dishonest. The whole MPC thing, it was very good. I agree with everything Susanne's saying. But of course, they are never going to get close to 50%. The best, I think, was, am I right, Susanne, around 35%? I think the best they've ever polled. So you know, so there's a bit of a dishonesty in there, and in some of the ads, like for the first time now, the NPC's got the chance to get over 50. So I would love to also have this thing sorted out beforehand, so that you also know, you know, it takes also out some of the anxieties around if and so on that people get worried about. So I would like that too, but yeah, unlikely to get that, obviously, because it's such a new thing in our country.
I like these type of research because it's about, they're quite citizen-centric, and where we often would make these assumptions about, oh, ordinary people don't know this and that and the other. Meanwhile, they think deeply about these issues, especially when you have these discussions. So there's a lot of insight. I don't think we should just take them merely for stats. You know, the one that, there are two that actually stood out for me, the two stats. The one being that a third wouldn't feel betrayed. So to me, it speaks to, is it on the basis of them understanding that it would be the parties reconciling their ideological differences for the sake of building South Africa? Or is it in the hope that service delivery is going to become the focus of those? So I'm quite intrigued by that. And then the fact that also that, you know, the second thing being that there is this, on a national level, that's how I understood it, that there's a less interest in kind of coalition or in favor of that. And I would think, given it's mainly based on our past experiences. This is not something that we have experienced on a provincial, national level, which is about structures, right? It's about the structure of governance, the administration and management of those resources, and also then political parties giving policy direction, and also aligning themselves with certain ideas. And unfortunately, what we have in the South African context is that we don't really scrutinize these ideas. Yes, we use these labels quite freely. I feel that, okay, that one is left-leaning, right-leaning, nationalistic, and liberal, and so on and so forth. But when we engage with these political parties, we don't really scrutinize their ideas for what they are, to say that, okay, when as a neoliberal posing type of party, what in essence are you aiming to achieve? How do you reform? We just accept at face value when someone says, for employment, we're going to create 5 million. But we don't say what does that policy tell us. And I'm wondering whether then that reluctance is based on because voters don't know how these political parties will be shaping up. Because South Africans, as much as it is my sense of South Africans is that in our homes and families, our political discussions are mostly based about social values and also what we're experiencing outside. My street light's not working, but also these young people are into drugs and drinking and all this type of thing. So those are the type of discussions, and they highlight two things: service delivery and a bit of ideology.
Yeah, so I think that's a nice kind of lead to this next point in a way, because I think from the public, from society, we're hearing perhaps at that level at which politics touches us is at that level of delivery of services, and whether that's a drive for quite a lot of what we're seeing in some of the results that Nanya talked to us about, but also the level at which the public generally understands and digs deeper into kind of, even politicians themselves. I think it's both ways, right? How much they are driven by ideology, or whether there's a whole lot of other sets of values that shape and determine what one does at that political level, and how and the extent to which societies understand that. So the second half of this conversation, really, we want to be focusing on what are some of the principles and practices that political parties should be mindful of when negotiating and forming coalitions. Some of the conversation already has kind of alluded to some of the challenges where, in a way, my individual needs or personalities, that might drive quite a lot of what shapes a coalition agreement, the absence or the presence of ideology as a kind of thing that kind of grounds us. But what are some useful things you think politicians should be thinking about in kind of setting up or trying to form some coalition agreements? Well, Lucy looks like he's ready to kick us off. Were you ready? Or were you just stretching?
Okay, I'll go. I do think principles of transparency and accountability are foremost important, especially for ordinary people. If politicians apply themselves from the perspective of what would the voter like to see? What am I hearing on the ground? Then they'll know that when these terms are bandied about, it's not just commentators and researchers that kind of speak about transparency and accountability. We just kind of outline how these look like. But if a political party that works with another is quite transparent about how they're going to work together and what they prioritize, that's of course in the agreement, which Prof. Susan has kind of alluded to, that making that quite apparent to everyone to know that this is but I would even go further, right? Involve your voters / members in that process, to be like, okay, as we shape it. I'm not saying like this, the heavy kind of work in it, but involve them in the process, because we need to create a really participatory system of governance, and that is becoming less and less, where the voter feels excluded from all these processes. It's just merely rock up to vote. So that's the one thing: transparency and those agreements. Accountability. So is a person simply okay? Does the partnership become null and void on the basis that we're not happy with the fact that you won't put so and so as a minister, or does it at least is there more depth to that, and kind of thinking about it? So So are we going to have performance reviews? And how do these look like? Who do these who do the people account to? So do we use the kind of institutional frameworks that we have? For example, we have the and the Auditor General, who will release reports annually. But one of the big gripes that we have is that these recommendations are not really taken seriously. So imagine a scenario where now these type of reports are used to feed into looking at performance and people being held accountable for their portfolios. Then it starts looking different. And if that becomes a way in which how relationships are constructed between political parties, it may actually be a bit interesting. So that's what I'll say for now. Sure.
Thank you. Go for it.
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much, Melissa. I largely agree with that. I think the focus really has to move, will have to move to a practical program, convergence on practical issues. It will be a big challenge to political parties because they will have to move beyond the big antagonisms of the current campaign, and the other one, the seeming or pretended ideological differences between the parties. South African politics and the different political parties center so much on a center, slightly left, and there's so much convergence in practical programs, possible practical programs. So I think there's a lot of prospects for that kind of convergence on practical programs. They will, however, have to show absolute commitment to agreements. Once they settle on cooperating, working together, they will have to commit themselves to working together for a certain period, because we're moving into this unregulated period where there won't be consequences. Unfortunately, not if political parties withdraw from agreements. If they decide by tomorrow, we get a better deal, we get the deputy presidency from this potential majority. And that kind of intense need for discipline, maturity among political parties to realize that they have to work for service, for transformation of society in a dedicated, serious way. That is the biggest challenge that I see in this period coming, that they won't just stay with a kind of learned behavior that we've seen so much evidence on in the bad cases. Agree, not all cases of local coalitions were bad. There were many successful, stable ones as well. But roughly half of them have been unstable and destructive. And sure, one didn't need a coalition to get to unstable and destructive government. There were so many cases beyond the coalition councils locally. So, but that service to people and commitment to governing together jointly with other parties. And yes, it's a totally different field. There will be so much responsibility on civil society to come to the party and stand up and demand coalition watch actions, because political parties are not going to do it. I'm totally surprised we still go out and vote for political parties. Thank you.
Absolutely. Who wants to go? Melanie, she's looking over ahead. We'll come to you. And then Nanya.
All right. A while ago, I asked the Irish, he's just finished his term, the Irish Taoiseach or the Irish Prime Minister, because they had a very interesting, I asked him this question, because they had a very interesting situation in Ireland where they struggled to get a coalition going. And then in the end, two parties formed a coalition government, but they agreed that what they will do is halfway through the term, they'll swap over. So one party would govern for the first half and then they would swap it over. But for that to work, and I asked him, what are the lessons you've learned? Was that he said the most important thing was to get a plan, a detailed plan for the government, which everybody agreed on. Secondly, he said a certain amount of humbleness is really required. That's where our politicians are going to suckle. And then, obviously then to focus on delivery. The problem I have with all of these discussions are that our problem in South Africa, when we're talking about delivery and so on, yes, there is some delivery happening at national level, and of course there's money issues, et cetera, but a lot of the things that we've just been speaking about that affects people often at local government level. That's not going to change, whatever government we get on a national level, unless the government starts really prioritizing the issues that we are facing at local government. And that's a big, big problem. Secondly, the other problem that we have, and which is also very difficult to fix, is of course that our civil service have been weakened significantly, and particularly under the Zuma years. And that is also has very little to do ultimately with the coalition agreements. And that's often where the bulk of the work happens. That's where regulations get drawn up. That's where policy starts being developed, et cetera, et cetera. And at the moment, we are struggling as a country, both on a national and a provincial level. And like I said, local government in many places are an absolute disaster. So this is a bit of a downer on this whole thing around coalitions. I mean, I actually think, I don't actually see that much is going to change, no matter what the coalitions look like. I think ultimately, decisions get taken on a national level at cabinet. The majority is going to rule. Their ministers can't just go off, no matter what party they are, and design their own policies. It has to come through cabinet. And then, I mean, like I've said, our big weakness lies at local government level and provincial, but then in general at the civil servants that needs to be strengthened again. And that is a big job, and it's going to be very challenging to do that.
And who does that, Susan? Whose job is it to do that? Sorry.
Or me.
Yeah, sorry, Melanie. I was looking at Melanie and Susan.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, Melanie. Yes.
I was also looking. It's ultimately it is government, but it's very easy to mess up a civil service. It's very difficult to repair it again, because first of all, it's quite easy to appoint people. It's very difficult to get rid of people, and so once you actually start getting this rot that has set in many levels, not all, there are still some really committed and good civil servants, and I want to say that. But once you sort of get a rot that sets in, it's very, very difficult, because now, I mean, we all know the statistics about how many people are on suspension. In some departments, there are more people on suspension than actually working, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very, very challenging thing to fix. And it is ultimately government's responsibility. But it's not as easy as even replacing politicians, through an election and through lists, et cetera.
Great. Nanya, did you want to add?
Yes, thanks. I'm really glad that Melanie's mentioned civil servants and public servants. In South Africa, we really worship politicians. They're like our local celebrities, right? Like our Hollywood. And we forget that they aren't the people that do the work, that actually do the work. So we've seen through some of the research that we've done, in particular for the Public Service Commission, that there is a lot of tension at the political administrative interface. In other words, there's a lot of political interference in the administration, in the work of public servants, and that needs to stop. And one of the ways that can be done, or two of the ways that can be done, is first of all professionalizing the public service or the civil service. So no matter what politician, no matter what political party comes into power, you have the machine that still works. So you can have, this movement at the top, but you have the institutions and the machinery that continues to work, continues to deliver. And then also to inculcate the values that are necessary to be a good public servant or to be a good civil servant. And those values exist in the Constitution. So it all comes back, I believe, to the Constitution and to honoring the Constitution and the values embodied in the Constitution. Because, for example, the inequality in this country is driving the dissatisfaction. And equality is an essential value embedded in our Constitution. And if we don't deal with inequality in South Africa, we are going to be in deep, deep trouble.
So, Susan, did you want to go ahead?
Just very briefly, yes, professionalisation of the civil service is an absolutely imperative. It's going to be such a tough task because how do you turn over civil servants? How do you turn over institutions, form new institutions, new processes? So much of that has been corrupted. So much of it is compromised. In some ways, I'm actually surprised that any political party wants to run for power, because it's almost inevitable that a coalition is going to be questioned, is going to be discredited, will have to bear with a lot of political reputational damage from entering and trying to run the state, which is not failed, but which certainly contains so many failing and sometimes failed institutions. So it is a massive task for any incoming coalition to be able to make sense, and even more, to make a success, potentially, of government post-election.
So I must thank the panel for kind of bringing us down to, I feel like completely depressed now. I started feeling a little hopeful when we started. There were some nice words. They said things like excitement, transformative, key moment, a transitional moment. Yeah, there were some negative things, but there's both. And so kind of as we are ending this conversation, I think one of the things that's coming up is the sense of this reminder as we come to the end of coalition governments could speak to this moment and an opportunity for governing differently. And there's a possibility we might see that now in this general election. But I think what the conversation is bringing us to is a reminder of underneath that, there are still so many things that still need to be shifted and addressed. So when I ask the panel, we'll just do a round. We'll open up for a few questions from the audience and those online. But maybe just a kind of a concluding thought for you, you know, and I think particularly if you want to just think of a concluding thought on this topic of coalition governments, what could they bring us at this particular moment in our democracy? A sense of what you've heard from both your own views, but also what you've heard from some of the data, from what civil society is saying about this. If you can maybe just give us a concluding thought as we kind of wrap up this conversation. So Melanie, we're going to start with you and then come into the room.
Look, I think and I realized I was being a bit of a downer there. Sorry about that. But I think I'll try and lift it a little bit by saying the first thing is that I think new voices in the room is always good. People who are in the room and bringing new ideas, bringing new voices. I think that is really important. I also think that it's never healthy for one party to remain that strong. And I think some of the arrogance of the ANC, should they fall below 50%, will hopefully also be mellowed a little bit. You know, the fact that not that much will change is negative, but there's also a positive in that. And the positive is that our system is strong. I need to explain this correctly, but the positive is the fact that things don't change that fast and that dramatically also means our system is stable. And this is what, so even if we bring coalition governments in, as long as, and I agree so much with what a few speakers have said, and I think, Sun, you said it last, is the thing that we just have to get some form of agreement or preferably legislation passed, which prevents parties from just withdrawing from the coalition and letting it fall. But I think the fact that not so much will change, the positive of that is that the system is stable and that our democracy holds and that the institutions hold, etc. So, yeah, that's me trying to be a little bit positive. Heidi, not sure
and we
that
thank
I'm succeeding.
we thank you. You tried. Thanks very much, Melanie. We appreciate that. Yeah, and I think this point about, anyway, I'm not going to repeat what you just said. Yes, thank you. Lucy, we'll come to you, and then we'll end with the two on your side, either side of you.
I think earlier on, there was this point about South Africa being a kind of a center-left party. And if that's so, and I have an instinct that perhaps we are, right? And to kind of put this to test, it would be interesting to see if in the next 5 years, whether the kind of coalition government we have work on a framework or an agreement that kind of that actually reflects this, but also more importantly, with priority areas, right? So are we more of an inward-looking country, focusing on social development? So are we going to have like a 2.0 RTP moment or 2.0 NDP moment? And that might be the catalyst for a good coalition government where we start seeing some movement trickling from a national level to local. I think it's actually kind of unfortunate that we had to do it the other way around. But maybe now we have an opportunity where the national/provincial government will be shaping the policy environment. I don't think we need to be fixated about legislating. Not everything that we do needs to be legislated in terms of coalitions. If anything, that might lock us into endless battles and courts and all this type of things, and then which then stalls governance. Hence, I use the word stagnation because I thought that might be the situation. But if we are more easygoing and the politicians illustrate the level of trust amongst each other, and they're consistent and they agree on priority areas, I think we might see something new emerging over the course of the next 5 years.
Thank you. I so wish that this could be an era in which we are really entering a heightened form of cooperation between parties, because we are in a national crisis where policies don't work, where institutions are often dysfunctional. Where political parties can just cooperate, put their egos aside, put their individuals' agendas aside, and find that convergence and really form a type of coalition, national government of national unity after these elections. Because if we get repeated, continuous, small gains, always sabotage coalitions that are in place, always try to construct an alternative one that is not going to take us any further. And we're really at a point in our society where we can still move forward constructively. So I so wish that the type of coalition that we approach can actually take that form. I agree with Malusi, we cannot have everything regulated. Everything is not going to regulate it. But we really have to appeal to political parties in the absence of that type of regulation, which is not present and which is not feasible, quite frankly. But to embrace constructive, cooperative governance for a period for this period that comes in South African politics now, when no single party dominates any longer, even if it may remain the predominant party. But let's use that space that is opening for that. Thank you.
I think that's a beautiful way of saying it, Susan, a space that's opening. So as much as I say that I believe that the ANC is going to do better than people think they are, things are still changing. Spaces are still opening. And I think 2029 is going to be a very pivotal year for this country. And what happens from now until 2029 is going to determine where we're going in future. What's important is what lies ahead for South Africa. We are mired in a lot of destructive behavior in this country towards one another. And a lot of that comes from the top. The fish rots from the top, so to speak. But I think what I am glad about is that we won't have to wait for the second coming for the ANC to not be in power. I think it's going to happen before then.
Okay, so no, we're not waiting for the second coming. Let's see if there are any comments in the room, and we'll take a couple from anyone in the room and then a couple from those online and ask our panel to respond. Any? Yes, please.
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Larato. Thank you very much for this very informative session. I'm not going to lie, I have not been engaged in anything about elections up until this week. This is also because I think there's so much going on, you know, with the George scenario, but also it's just been a very politically intense year, and I think just coming in from last year, it's sort of overflowing into this year. I just wanted to get a quick, sorry, please remind me, how many registered voters, rough figure, if anybody knows on the panel, are there, as opposed to eligible voters? How many people are registered to vote? Because I just wanted to see against the national population. I wanted to talk about the election, the actual machinery, the technology that's going to be used and employed. Does anybody know anything about that? There's big questions going on amongst, it's a big conversation I've been listening to briefly on the radio, about the actual ballot itself and how it's going to be counted and tallied. That's seemingly something that seems to be concerning a lot of the population, and even in my community chat groups, elderly people seem to be completely confused by this. I think there's a lot of talk about this idea of a GNU Volume 2, or someone is calling it CODESA Volume 2. I think the former the incumbent president and another former president are sort of having this discussion. I'm just not sure what we're going to discuss there, is my challenge there. I think there's a lot of perhaps wanting to resurrect a particular historical nostalgia that may no longer be resonant with this particular generation. And I think the fact that we may not know what we're going to discuss is also indicative of the fact that we don't know what our younger generation wants and thinks of this country. I think Melanie said something earlier about rebuilding and re-engineering the professional public service, that it's very difficult to break down and equally as difficult to resurrect once again. I think you're very right about that, Melanie. But I think that the institutional damage is not just at the public service, it's across board. And most imperatively and most challengingly in the judiciary. I'm very worried about what's going on in South African judiciary right now, not just with the magistrates being on strike, but I think what's going on within that entire judicial ambit of government is very, very worrying. This is a telltale sign of African states collapsing, is the judiciary beginning to become a bit erratic.
Great. I think there was another comment. Let's take the other comment and then we'll ask panelists to respond to. Yes, please.
I'm Siam Tanda from News 24. Mine is a question. It's two questions really. About I know that we touched a bit on the difference of it being a national election versus a local government election and what we've seen at a local government level, but in the two provinces that are set for a coalition government, how can those parties that come in there navigate the fact that the people in the public service will be or might be aligned to a certain party, those loyalties? How can they navigate that? And also, my second question is, in terms of the GNU versus a coalition, is South Africa more suited for a coalition or a GNU type of scenario? And yeah, that's all for now. Thank you.
So quite a few from a couple on GMU. Susan, do you want to take those? Versus coalitions, what are those, how they're different? Quite a few around, that first speaker around just how many registered voters, technology ballot. Malusi, if you want to maybe take those, and maybe Nanya and Melanie kind of comment on some of the others about public service across the board, judiciary, the state of it, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Briefly on the GNU coalition. We generally take a GNU as a grand form of coalition, as the inclusive one that takes on board all other major parties come together. That is, in essence, the definition of a good coalition. Granted, the conditions of for GNU, early 1990s, that culture was completely different. We knew, South Africans knew they had to come together. There was such strong memories of the oppression, brutal oppression of the apartheid era, of the violence that was used in a run-up to the election, some for liberation, some to counter-liberation. So there was really a true sense that we need to cooperate. I'm not sure we have that sense at this stage in South African politics, although I think that would be constructive. That would be amazing if that can happen over a broad front. But South Africans have lost their political innocence in that way. We are not just trusting the state and the new state anymore. We know it would be so difficult to change it. We probably know there will be so many people trying to undermine that again. So we haven't got that sense of innocence that prepared the ground for conciliatory government. But a better realization of how destructive coalition government can be may help push people in that direction, because cooperative coalition government can be amazing and can bring wonders, I believe, but we still need to get into that space. Thank you.
I'm not sure of the stats, but I think there's over 27 million registered voters. We can only hope that many of those will go, because that will make the results quite interesting for some of us. And then, maybe just to, I'm in agreement with Prof. Susan, is that governments of national unity often come out after a period of turmoil. It's mostly when people are like, okay, we don't want to kind of put in youthful language, we don't want any more drama. We need to roll up our sleeves and just get working and keep the peace as much as we can, because anything could happen. Now, the problem with South Africa is that, there's still a level of disingenuous. I think Lerato mentioned some of the presidents talking about a CODESA 2 or some sort or anything like that. When this discussion was raised by, was it former commissioner of IEC or something, to say that in theory, we should have been actually holding back to actually deal with issues of governance an election, that idea was kind of poo-pooed, to say no. But now the politicians are saying, these politicians at least, are saying, no, let's do it after the elections. But that tells me that they're not reading the room, because people have an issue of trust when it comes to you. So are you willing to have a discussion prior to you being given that power? Or do you now want to first get the power and then afterwards just lull people into some social contract that they're not going to buy into? It can't be that. So it's a level of disingenuous. So we need to be thinking about these type of things. And we also need to think about, I just want to say, I know it made me think about when these points were made, that what level of tension is going to be made by the fact, well, of course, the voter turnout is going to be quite interesting, right? But if we have a coalition, to me, a coalition kind of speaks to fragility, particularly in our situation. So what do we do about the voter base that did not participate in the elections? Why didn't they participate? Is because they are so disillusioned. And what does it mean then for the social fabric going forward? These are other points of contention that we need to really, really consider.
Melanie, you want to hop in?
Yeah, so on the stats, when it is correct that it's 27.7 million people out of eligibility of 40. There's 42.3 million eligible voters, 27.7 registered. That's about 65%. So it means 15 million citizens did not register to vote. There's a interesting statistic. There's 3 million more women that registered than men. So parties can do well of addressing some of the women's issues. Not that I'm actually hearing them do that. And the other interesting thing is that only about 5 million out of the eligible 15 million youth voters, so those, I think that's under 30, if I'm not mistaken, registered. So there's still a very low registration number. And it was earlier raised by Nanya that that youth block is a very interesting block to look out for the future. You asked how the ballots will be tallied this time around. I don't believe, unless I've missed something, that it's going to be any different from previous times. And what happened in the past was, so the ballots people vote at the individual polling stations, and then when the ballot boxes close or the polling election stations close, the individual political parties are there as observers. They are always observers. There's also international observers. They literally throw out the ballot papers. The different 3 ballot papers are kept separately, and then They literally call it, they lift it up and say ANC for this one, ACDP for this one, DA for this one, and they put it on piles, and people, if there's a dispute, they put it separate, and they then deal with that later, and that then gets pushed through to the IEC, which is going to be in a center at Gallagher Estate. They collate, they make sure that there's no severe issues. When there's disputes, they try and deal. They've got a whole dispute resolution committee there, and they try and resolve the issues. And once they've got all the votes and there's nothing dramatically big outstanding, they announce, the chairperson of the IEC announce it. I think the only confusion that I do still pick up is this issue around this suddenly that we have a third ballot. And I feel a lot more voter education should be done around that. Although my guess is what the parties are just saying to everybody is vote whatever party you're voting on all three ballots. But I think what is interesting, and some of the opinion polls have shown that people also understand, and they've started to do that at local government elections. I think the first time really significantly 2 local government elections back, where people start understanding that they can split their vote. So they can, on the national party list for the National Assembly, which is your first ballot, they can maybe vote for one political party. Then you've got your provincial for national ballot, which is also for the National Assembly, but there you could maybe vote for an independent. And then you've got your provincial one where you can either vote for another party or for another independent. So I hope that answers Lorato's question. Just I think it was Siamtanda who asked the question around politically appointed people. What happens, for example, in a province, if you think that the civil servants are politically appointed, and of course many of them are. Now they are strictly speaking not supposed to be. They are supposed to be professional civil servants, but we do know through the cadre deployment that some of them, even though they are supposed to be civil servants, would be deployed. Very little you can do about that. You just have to kind of work with them. And of course, if they then transgress, then disciplinary procedures can take place. There is a small group of civil servants which are appointed, which are political appointments, who goes with the political head, either the minister or the MEC, and there's a few of them at local government level as well, although less so. They stop. So the moment the political head is not there, they stop. But that's a minority. That's not, that's not the huge amount. The rest of them, you have to live with them unless they start, like I said, doing something wrong.
My name is Burton Joseph. I'm from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Is the ANC about to be defeated at the polls? Are we heading for a coalition government? I take a more regional perspective by looking at the performance of incumbent parties as well liberation movements and make a prediction based on their performance. I actually think we're not heading for any of the two. If we look at the situation in South Africa at the moment, I think the opposition is simply too fractured to facilitate them dislodging an incumbent. We are talking of 70 parties and independents contesting elections at various levels. For me, that's certainly not a formula to be of success, to defeat more specifically such a formidable opponent that you are facing with during this forthcoming election. Secondly, I also think within the opposition ranks, we haven't seen the requisite mobilization and organization that is required, tapping into the widespread discontent within society largely. We've got to admit that the ANC at present is very vulnerable, simply based on the revelations which are contained in your state capture report. The effects of the maladministration of the previous administration showed up during the current term of this president. Unfortunately, they haven't exploited that sufficiently. to their benefit. If we look at the performance of parties in the region, there were also times when Frelimo, MPLA, ZANU-PF faced challenges, to their hegemony. But they've been able also to reinvent themselves as a means to gain their trust and public confidence from unhappy, dissatisfied, disenchanted electorate. And it has worked for them. This is what we are seeing at the moment as well in South Africa. The ANC has unleashed its operation machinery across the lengths and breadths of the country. That's what you would have expected from the opposition if they were serious about either dislodging the ANC or aiming for any coalition government. In fact, we have seen that election machinery being unleashed by the incumbent party itself, which really disadvantaged the opposition. So, yeah, those are just my looking at it from a regional perspective, instead of confiding myself to the dynamics. Political parties reinvent themselves. There's also, of course, the issue of patronage, which get dispensed, and they have used this very effectively as incumbent parties. And we have seen it here as well. And I'm sure you are familiar with, the modes, what gets done. Professor Boyson's report, for example, of the political situation in Zimbabwe prior to the 2013, or in the prelude to the 2013 elections. ZANU-PF read the report and they exploited it to their own benefit. So it's ways of how do incumbent parties behave when they are on their back foot. So that's just my...
Some very interesting points there.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take the last comment from the gentleman in the red hat, and then we'll ask the panel to comment, please.
Oh, thank you very much to the presenter, to the House at large for the engagements of today. So, as myself, David Ngubuka, as concerned citizen, now we also like to measure also the sustainable development gems. As we know, the country, this presidential term of the targets, 2030 targets. So we wonder, could we consider as the gross election monitoring system that the politics of South Africa are influenced by tribalism? For instance, we see Zuma Beach, for instance, in KZN, as now he's emerging with the other party outside the ANC. Could we consider an exit for KZN as a province? Like the consideration of Western Cape also as a province, the exit from the national government and independent provincial state. So we also like to answer if this coalition is seeking to call for the sentiments of ransom. Would other small parties be held ransom for decisions? For instance, the consideration of the changing of the Section 25, for instance, which normally rallied with the whole people of the country. So do we also consider, or do we see as a country having tools that could sustain also the perceived civil war, for instance, if maybe the perpetuation or the jurisprudence of Zuma issues are not dealt before the date of After Workers' Day? Yeah. So do we also consider if maybe it's influenced by labor? Does the labor movement also have the say as organized structures also in the elections? Yeah, I think I could try to be as brief there.
Thanks very much. There were lots there. So I'm going to ask the panel, just by way of just wrapping up and concluding, to choose any of, to respond to the comment, that regional perspective. The last speaker's given us a range of kind of questions to think about. So as you conclude, choose one of those just to respond to and make your concluding comments. And we'll start in the room for a change. Should we start with you, Nania?
Thank you very much, Heidi. Yes, there's a lot that's been said. I think the regional perspective is a very interesting one. For some people, probably a very worrying one, because Africa is not well known for its multi-party democracies. So we need to understand, yes, that parties reinvent themselves, but we also need to think about, what kind of a democracy we want. And that do we want that party dominance to continue, forever, rather than get something new and something fresh into the space. There are quite a lot of questions that came up around, will KwaZulu-Natal and Western Cape, for example, sort of leave national. I don't think so. I don't think that there will be any form of secession, but I mean, there might be new provincial governments or old provincial governments. And of course, the provincial government is still subject to national policy to a large extent, but they do have their own legislatures. So provinces are relatively powerful in this country. And maybe we also need to have that conversation going forward. National, provincial, local, is it working? That this three-layer cake that we have in South Africa, is it working? Is it not working? Intergovernmental relations are a little bit of a mess. People don't know who's responsible for what kind of services to be delivered, either municipally or provincially. And that is something that causes a lot of frustration when doors are knocked on and your local councillor says, oh, sorry, but that's a provincial matter. You'll have to go and have it sorted out at another level. That kind of politics, it just doesn't work. So I think we need to think about a whole lot of things other than coalition governments. We need to think about how to make things new in many other different ways in South Africa.
Yeah. Great. Melusi, to you?
Yeah, I think it was quite interesting to hear the kind of regional perspective on things. And I say this because there's this, at least when you monitor public sentiment in South Africa when it comes to ZANU-PF, there's kind of very huge skepticism about it in terms of how it administers elections and how governance happened there. I don't know if there have been that kind of glaring signs of behavior, at least in the South African context. I think we've had the normal mudslinging, and it happens from election to election. I don't think we need to be. We need to hone in and be just cautious and watch out for it, because it can't spiral out of control. But it comes with the elections. It kind of adds to the tension. And I know that on social media, particularly, these discussions about independent Cape kind of gain attraction, but these are like far fringe ideas. These are not ideas that are being entertained on a mainstream level, or just at least society within South Africa. I don't see that happening, particularly in the next 5 years. There are too many serious things to be handled for us to be talking about segregating. Equally for this whole narrative about KZN, right? These provinces are too integrated in the South African economy to now all of a sudden to be viewed. So take it just for what it is. Engage for it on that level. I don't, you know, it would be interesting to see. I think the question about land that was raised, that will really be based on what kind of coalition do we see playing out. Is it a coalition that's really going to want to rupture things and shift constitutionally? And what's going to be the quid pro quo, so to speak, for those political parties? So I'm afraid to say that I don't think we're going to see any major shifts on that level. Politicians, whether we like it or not, I think they're more concerned about stabilizing the situation because they can tell that there's a lot of simmering happening in society. We don't necessarily pay attention to it as much perhaps in our discussions on radio and television, but people are very dissatisfied, and the last thing you need is a 2021 July unrest type of situation that's happening on a national level.
Yeah, thank you. Susan?
Thank you very much. Yes, particularly on the regional perspective, thank you very much for that. You're talking exactly what I believe we are saying in slightly different ways here so far. Opposition is definitely too fragmented to dislodge the ANC. We're not talking about dislodging the ANC entirely here. The bottom line is dislodging the ANC potentially from majority power, majority vote, and from the ability to govern on its own. It is pretty sure that the ANC will be in government, I would say probably with some minor parties after the election. And that is definitely not quite the definition of dislodging the ANC from power. The ANC and its liberation movement, sister organizations in the region, have been very good at maintaining those relations and at learning from one another. We know when ZANU-PF really got into power, into problems, I'm not talking 1980 now, into problems, then the ANC took on the message, that is a lesson to us, never to get to the position where we have to use outright violence on our own people. And the ANC has been doing pretty well, using state apparatuses in particularly and widespread propaganda apparatuses to get to that point of not having to use that. So the big question is whether the ANC will still have sole power after the election. And that is a big setback for it if it does not have it. Because of patronage, use of state resources, state apparatuses, there will be much more transparency and forced accountability if we get that kind of coalition. And that is the point we get to in this election. Thank you.
Thank you. And Melanie, to you.
One thing on the fragmentation of the opposition, of course it is true, right? And of course it's also true the more parties we have, the more those votes get fragmented. And honestly, you know, with all that was going on with the ANC for the last, well, since the Zuma years, it absolutely boggles my mind that the DA has not been able to pick up more votes. And it's indicative of their own internal issues, which they're facing, including the leadership issues. Because if you think about it, they should have just been sitting back and raking in the votes, but instead they seem to be scoring own goals again with this election as well, and certainly previously. The positive thing, of course, of our electoral system and about this fragmentation is that you do get a colourful parliament, that no votes go to waste, or well, until now, that, you know, we do get parties with 30,000 votes getting one seat, and, you know, every now and then get the opportunity to speak. They can't make a big impact. But we also saw in the Zuma years, once the opposition actually worked together, they actually did make a big impact. So there is a negative to it and the fragmentation, but there's also something positive, which was obviously also when we wrote the Constitution, what we had in mind, that it doesn't just end up being a two-party state or a three-party state, that we did want the diversity and the colourfulness and the different voices to be reflected in our parliament. Just briefly, since I live in the Western Cape, this whole issue about secession and so on, those who want to do it base it on section 2235 of the Constitution, which is really the Urania clause. I know it's of general application, but I mean, it's the Urania clause that was put into the Constitution. And what it says is that those who share a similar cultural and language heritage in that area that they can form a sort of independent area. That's never going to be the case in the Western Cape. There isn't a common cultural or linguistic heritage in the Western Cape. And certainly that is also, there's a predominant one in KwaZulu-Natal, but that's not a common one everywhere. So I even think legally it is, it's just not going to happen. But what I do believe we're going to see is more and more pressure from a provincial level to have more of the national powers delegated to them, as we're seeing in the Western Cape around policing and that kind of thing. And that's going to be an interesting debate, which, I agree with Nanya that, those are maybe the discussions that should be held in certain instances. Sorry, I didn't hear the gentleman who spoke last's name, but he also mentioned tribalism. But that's something I think we should really try and push against in our country, that enters political domain too much. We've seen now, yes, with the MK party, a very definite sort of resorting to tribalism. And of course, we're not free of that, and we haven't been free of that in our country, but at least it's not been the predominant factor that has been pushed by any political party or significant political party until now with MK. And I think that's a very dangerous fragmentation that can happen. The others are not as dangerous as the tribal one, which could easily spill over into violence and a huge amount of intolerance, far more beyond what we've seen now. So I really think that should be pushed against as much as possible.
So thank you very much to our really wonderful panel. Please do give them a round of applause. I think it's been a really rich and fascinating conversation. I do think, this is just my own 2 cents, I'm not a political analyst or political democracy governance person at all. I mean, I do poetry and HIV, so there you go. But there is a sense, certainly just in reflecting on my own personal experience of living in this country, a sense that this does feel like a slightly different election that we're entering into. The sense of disquiet or dissatisfaction that I think a lot of us are feeling. The big question is the extent to which that translates into voting, right? So we really want to just encourage and push, and everyone, we all should kind of, whatever the dissatisfaction is that you're feeling, translate that into a vote, exercise that vote on those 3 levels. You also need to watch out on the results. 45, 46, 47, 48, 50, 50 plus 1. This is where you heard it first. So please vote and then watch out for those results. And you can say it was at that HSRC event that so-and-so predicted this outcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.